The woman was drawing in the dirt outside the eastern gatehouse when Seo-rin found her. Not scratching idle marks the way a bored traveler might, not tracing the meaningless loops of someone whose mind had come loose from its moorings, though that was what the gatehouse guards had decided, and what the small knot of onlookers had decided, and what the woman's fraying robes and matted hair seemed to confirm. She was on her knees in the packed earth of the road, one finger moving with the unhurried precision of a calligrapher, laying down a curve that swept outward from a center point in a long, controlled spiral, then another, then a third, offset from the first by some interval that was not random, not approximate, but exact in the way that only a mind holding a number can make a hand exact. Seo-rin stopped walking. The woman did not look up. Her finger completed the arc, lifted, returned to the center, began again on a new curve that rolled outward to meet the first at an angle that was, Seo-rin's eye caught it before her mind named it, conjugate. The two curves met in the way gear teeth must meet if the load is to transfer smoothly, if the velocity ratio is to hold constant through the mesh, if the machine is to run and not merely turn. The ratio's wrong, the woman said to the dirt. Her voice was not distressed, exactly, but it had the quality of someone who has been saying the same true thing for a long time to people who could not hear it. If the pitch circles here, the curve must roll to there. Why can no one see it? She drew the pitch circle with one swift motion. She was right. Seo-rin had been trained in temple metrology, in the sacred geometries of the mandate's anchors, in the mathematics that underpinned the veil's focusing curves, and she knew an involute when she saw one. She also knew how rare it was to see one drawn freehand in road dust with a fingertip, at full accuracy, by a woman who appeared to have been sleeping in doorways. This woman isn't mad, Seo-rin thought, standing very still. She's the most precise mind in this town, and the world threw her in a gutter for it. I was in the gearworks when Seo-rin came to find me, and she did not explain on the way back. She just walked quickly and said, "Come and look." That was enough. Seo-rin did not summon people to look at things that were not worth looking at. The woman was still drawing when we arrived. The crowd had thinned, boredom or unease or both, and she had expanded her diagram to cover a span of road perhaps 3 paces across, a whole involute gear system laid out in the dust with pitch circles, base circles, pressure angles, the curve of each tooth flank traced with a finger that never wavered. She had not looked up. She was talking softly to the geometry, the way a person talks to a problem they are inside rather than observing. I crouched at the edge of the diagram and looked at it for a long moment. I had been fighting the gear problem for a month. The hobbing machine was built. The hob cutter, the indexing head, the feed mechanism, all of it assembled and functional in the way that a thing can be functional without being right. The gears it cut ran, but they did not run well. The tooth profiles were close to involute, but not truly involute, and in a low-speed cartwheel, that gap between close and true is noise and wear, but in an engine, it is the difference between a machine and a collection of parts destroying each other. I had the geometry in my head in the rough form that an engineer carries it, pressure angle, module, base circle radius, but the fine derivation, the precise relationship between the generating rack and the tooth flank curve, the exact offset corrections for undercutting at small tooth counts, the mathematical proof that would let me specify any gear in the system with confidence, that was past me. I had been working from memory and approximation was not going to be enough. I looked at the diagram in the dirt. "The geometry's past me," I said. "Can you read this?" The woman looked up for the first time. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been somewhere very far away and had just been handed a rope back. They focused on the drawing I had unrolled, a rough sketch of the gear train I needed, tooth counts, approximate module, the transmission ratios the engine would require, and the distance in them collapsed into something sharp and present and entirely awake. "You cut the sacred curves into steel," she said. Her voice had changed. The muttering quality was gone. "The temple worshipped these, and you put them to work." She stood up. She was taller than I had expected. "Give me chalk right now." Her name was Pyo Eun-ha. She had been a geometer at the Eastern Anchor Temple. Not a ceremonial role, not a title given to someone who could copy diagrams, but a working position, a mathematician who calculated the focusing curves of the mandate's anchors, who derived the sacred geometries that concentrated the veil's power at each node. The curves she had spent her life on were involutes, epicycloids, the same families of curves that govern how gear teeth meet and roll and transfer force without slipping. The temple had called them sacred. She had called them beautiful and also true, which is a different thing. When the mandate began to fail, when the anchors went dark one by one, and the sacred geometry became, as she put it, decoration for a corpse, the temple had cast her out. Not cruelly, perhaps. Simply, the work was done, the knowledge was no longer needed, the geometer had no function. She had been drawing in the dirt ever since, because the curves did not stop being true simply because no one needed them, and someone should draw them, even if it was no one. They told me my life's work was decoration for a corpse, she said, later, when there was time for later. So I draw the curves in the dirt, someone should, even if it's no one. That was the only time I heard anything like bitterness in her voice, and it was not quite bitterness. It was the tone of a person reporting a fact that happens to be painful, the way you report a measurement that came out wrong. But that was later. In the moment she had chalk, and she had a wall. The wall of the gear works was whitewashed plaster, and within an hour of Pyo Eun-ha receiving a stick of chalk it was covered. Not covered the way a student covers a wall, with false starts and corrections and the visible evidence of thinking toward. Covered the way a river covers a floodplain, completely, inevitably, as though the wall had been waiting for exactly this. She worked from the center outward, establishing the base circle first, then the pitch circle, then the pressure angle. 20 degrees, she said, without looking up, because 20 degrees was correct for this application, and she would explain why, if I wanted the proof. And then the involute itself, the curve generated by unwrapping a taut string from the base circle, which is the only curve that satisfies the fundamental law of gearing, which states that the common normal to the tooth profiles at the point of contact must always pass through the pitch point, which is why the velocity ratio holds constant, which is why the load transfers smoothly, which is why the engine does not shake itself apart. She said all of this while drawing, not lecturing, thinking aloud, the way a person thinks when they are finally in a room where thinking aloud is permitted. It's the same as the anchor's focusing curve, she said, her chalk moving without pause. I always knew it was too beautiful to only be for magic. She sang a little while she worked, not a song with words, a kind of rhythmic humming that tracked the mathematics, that rose when the curve accelerated and steadied when it held a constant rate of change. It was not a performance. She was not aware she was doing it. It was simply what happened when Pyo Eun-ha was given a problem that was worthy of her. I stood back and watched and understood, in the particular way you understand something when you see it happen rather than being told about it, that the gear problem was solved. Seo-rin arrived in the afternoon, drawn by some instinct or by a message I had not sent. She stood in the doorway of the gearworks and looked at the wall and then at Pyo Eun-ha, and something passed between the two women that I did not entirely follow but recognized in outline. Two people who had been trained in the same tradition, who had been discarded by that tradition for the same reason, that the tradition had died and left them holding knowledge it no longer needed, recognizing each other across a chalked wall. Two temple girls the mandate spat out, Pyo said, without turning from the wall, building its replacement with the mathematics it discarded. The irony is almost a proof of something. Seo-rin did not answer immediately. She looked at the diagram for a long moment, reading it the way she read measurement records, carefully, without hurry, checking each line against the one before it. Then she said, "The pressure angle derivation on the third tooth count, you've carried it to 6 significant figures." 5 is sufficient, Pyo said. 6 is honest. Seo-rin made a small sound that, from her, was the equivalent of a laugh. By evening the hobber was cutting differently. Not because the machine had changed. The hob cutter, the indexing head, the feed screw, all of it was the same iron and wood and leather it had been that morning. What had changed was the specification. Pyo had translated the wall into a set of numbers, base circle radius to 4 decimal places of the module, pressure angle confirmed at 20 degrees, the precise feed rate, and hob rotation ratio that would generate a true involute flank rather than an approximation of 1. She had also derived the correction factors for tooth counts below 17, where undercutting becomes a problem, and the modified addendum values that would eliminate it. I set the hobber to her numbers and cut a test gear. The tooth flanks were smooth in a way the previous cuts had not been. I ran a mating gear against it by hand, feeling for the transfer of motion, and the velocity ratio held, not approximately, not close enough, but held constant through the mesh, the way it is supposed to hold. Transmissions, differentials, valve timing, the engine, I had known in the abstract that all of these were reachable once the gear problem was solved. Standing in the gear works with a correctly cut gear in my hand, I felt the distance to them collapse from theoretical to merely difficult. The curve doesn't lie, Pyo said, from where she was cleaning chalk from her hands with a rag. It has never lied. People just stopped listening to it. Any gear an engine needs, we can cut now, I said, and cut it again the same. The gates opened. Cho Yeong came in the next morning, as she always did, to check the previous day's cuts. She was 14 and had been with the work since the beginning, one of the orphan master's charges, who had turned out to have hands that knew metal the way some people know music, by feel, by the subtle wrongness of a surface that is not quite right. She picked up the test gear, turned it, ran her thumb along the tooth flanks, and then held it up to the light and rolled it against the mating gear with the slow attention of someone reading a text. "This tooth's proud," she said, touching one flank, "carries too early into the mesh." Pyo Eun-ha, who had been sitting at the workbench with a fresh sheet of paper and a brush, looked up. "Show me," she said. Cho Yeong showed her, not in words but by demonstrating the motion, the point in the mesh cycle where the load transferred too abruptly, the slight hesitation that followed it. Her hands were precise in a way that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with accumulated contact with material. Pyo Eun-ha watched with an expression I had not seen on her face before, not the focused intensity of the wall drawing, not the distant quality of the road, something warmer. "You felt what I'd have needed an hour to calculate," she said. "Marvelous child, show me where your fingers say it's wrong, I'll show you the number that proves you right." Cho Yeong blinked, unused to being called marvelous by anyone. Then she showed Pyo the tooth again, and Pyo went back to her paper, and the two of them worked through the correction together, the girl's hands and the geometer's numbers converging on the same answer from opposite directions. I watched them for a moment and then went back to the hobber. There was nothing useful I could add. The problem that remained was hardening. Gears cut to true involute geometry are soft. Soft gears wear. An engine's gear train runs under load, at speed, for thousands of cycles, and a soft tooth will round off at the tip, will pit at the pitch circle, will eventually fail. The gears had to be case-hardened, packed in carbonaceous material, and heated to drive carbon into the surface, then quenched to lock it there. And case hardening, as any smith knows, warps the workpiece. The heat moves the metal. A gear that was true before hardening will not be true after. I had been thinking about this problem since before Pyo arrived. I had not found a clean answer. Pyo found it in an afternoon. "The heat will twist the curve," she said, in the tone of someone stating a constraint rather than a problem. "Predictably, I'll tell you exactly how much." She paused, brush moving. "Cut them wrong so the hardening moves them right, or grind them after. Both. I'll give you the numbers." Cut them wrong so the hardening moves them right. I had known, in principle, that distortion could be anticipated and compensated, that if you knew the magnitude and direction of the warp, you could pre-distort the workpiece in the opposite direction and let the heat correct it. I had not had the mathematical framework to calculate the compensation. Pyo had it, or would have it by morning. The alternative was grinding after hardening, cutting the hardened tooth flanks back to true geometry with an abrasive wheel, which required a grinding setup we did not yet have, but could build. Both approaches together, cut with compensation, harden, grind to final truth, cut, harden, grind. The sequence was clear now. The path to engine-grade gears, hard enough to last, true enough to run, was laid out in front of us. We found her proper robes from the stores, not the temple robes she had lost, but clean wool, well-fitted, with the particular quiet dignity of clothing that has been chosen rather than merely obtained. Someone brought a proper brush case. Someone else cleared a section of the workbench and made it hers, with a lamp positioned for the angle she preferred and a supply of paper that would not run out. She stood in the gearworks in the late afternoon light, in clean robes, with chalk dust still on her hands and a new diagram half finished on the wall, and looked around at the sooty shed with its iron smell and its charcoal haze and its racks of cut gears waiting for the hardening sequence. "I had a great haul once," she said, "and a title." A pause. "And I've never been as useful as I am in this sooty shed. Funny old world." I had been thinking about what to say to that since the morning, and I had not found anything that was not either too much or too little. I settled for what was true. It's a better world than the one that threw you out. We built it that way on purpose. I looked at the gear rack, at the wall of chalk, at Cho Yeong in the corner checking tooth profiles with her thumb. "Now, let's make teeth that last forever." Pyo Eun-ha picked up her chalk. The curves, which had never lied, which had been waiting in the dirt of the road for someone to need them for something real, went back onto the wall.